My name is George Galloway, presenter of Kalima Horra on Al Mayadeen television. Morning to you. I don't mince my words. I speak Kalima Horra, and my audience does too. Kalima Horra, free word, free for me, free for you. Catch it. Nice to meet you, brother. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, coming to you from London, but talking about Ukraine. Specifically, the background to the current stage of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and between NATO and Russia. Looking at the Donbass, looking at the Minsk agreements, words that have now very belatedly crept into the public vocabulary in the West and in the East. The Donbass is part of the eastern side of Ukraine, overwhelmingly populated by ethnic Russian people, Russian-speaking people, and now many citizens of Russia. That was true even before the operation, which began a little over a year ago, the special military operation, otherwise known as the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and it's certainly true now because referenda were held in the liberated areas and the people overwhelmingly voted to rejoin Russia. So a new Russia, Novorus, is coming into view. What's the background to all of this? Most people know, at least the discerning that watch Kalima Horra, that this conflict did not begin a little over a year ago, but began at the very least in 2014, when the elected government of Ukraine was overthrown in a violent uprising, the parliament set on fire, the president put to flight, and members of the parliament being forced, literally in some cases at gunpoint, to pass a whole range of discriminatory measures against the Russian language, Russian culture, and, they felt, the Russian people. Almost 1/3 of the population of the country was thus alienated. Russia moved swiftly to take control of Crimea, for centuries a base for Russian naval operations, and subsequently the people of Crimea voted, again overwhelmingly, to rejoin Russia. The reality is that the military situation on the ground is unlikely ever to be reversed, although NATO and the government in Kiev continue to insist that Russia must withdraw from every square inch of the territory that was formerly Ukraine. That too is complicated, though, because the current territory, or at least the territory prior to 2022, was created by the Soviet Union, created by the USSR. Prior to that, many parts of what were Ukraine were actually somewhere else, somewhere in Poland. Some belonged to Hungary, and so on. So it was very much a Russian idea to create Ukraine in the current parameters, or the parameters at least that obtained before the special military operation. The shelling of the people of what we can call the Donbass was attested to not by Putin or by the Russians, but by the OSCE, the Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe. That organization has literally thousands of pages of documents of every shell that was shot, every bullet that was fired, every rocket that hit the civilian population of the Donbass. And some 14,000 people were killed over the 8 years from 2014 to 2022. This is not me saying this. This is the European Union, United Nations, OSCE, that is saying that. Now, it is the contention of the Russians that the Kiev government were ready to move decisively to try and crush all resistance to them in eastern Ukraine, and that therefore they were acting, legally speaking, in self-defense, or at least in the defense of their compatriots, of their co-religionists, of their co-Russian people. Now, this is a legal right exercised, for example, by Vietnam in Cambodia, by Tanzania in Uganda. But it's a legal right that was elevated, you may say, by the so-called Chicago Doctrine of Bill Clinton and Tony Blair, who arrogated to themselves what they called the right to protect, RTP, which gave people thousands of miles away from a conflict the right to invade that region far distant from them and justify it by the use of the right to protect doctrine. Hence, for example, Serbia was dismembered by NATO and a new country was carved out of it called Kosovo, not recognized by most countries in the world, but recognized by all but 2 of the members of NATO. So the Russian argument is that they had to do this, not least because the 2 attempts to find a diplomatic solution called the Minsk Agreements 1 and 2 had been comprehensively ignored by the people who signed it. Russia is not a signatory to the Minsk Agreement, but the government in Kiev is, and the authorities in the Donbass are. But moreover, the Minsk II agreement, which would have given autonomy to the eastern part of Ukraine and would have had Ukraine as a neutral, non-NATO country in perpetuity, were never intended to be implemented. We know that because the people who guaranteed it, the government of Germany and France, have both told us that the intention to implement these agreements was never there. And Mrs. Merkel was particularly candid. She said it was to buy time for the authorities in Kiev to build up their armed forces with the assistance of NATO. And so Russia will never again, one presumes, agree to any such agreements with any Western partners, having been, as they see it, comprehensively betrayed. Now, none of what I've just told you is common parlance in the West. They talk of the conflict in Ukraine as if it began just last year, even though many of the Western media outlets reported quite extensively on the slaughter of the innocents, 14,000 of them, in eastern Ukraine. They did deep dive exposés of the Nazi character of many of the military units that were doing the killing in the Donbass. Now they've all been wiped off the slate. They've probably been erased from the hard drives of the computers in the news organization headquarters. But those who wish to properly understand the conflict in Ukraine need to know all of what I have just said. And in fact, if the show were 3 times longer, I could go back much further than 2014. Now here, as always, I'm just the enthusiastic amateur. I'm joined by a panel of distinguished experts, some of them with very recent and first-hand knowledge of the region, one of whom is Fra Hughes from Northern Ireland, a journalist and writer and analyst who has multiple times been in the Donbass, once as an election observer, other times as a man who was determined to get the truth out about what was happening in that now forgotten conflict. Fra Hughes, thanks for joining us, travelling from Ireland to be with us. Did I make any errors of fact there? If I did, correct them. If I didn't, please add your perspective on this.
I was going to say everything you've said is exactly correct. And because I've been there on the ground, and I've met people, and I have personal friends now in the Donbass, I can explain that from their perspective, it is down to the Maidan coup in 2014. It's down to the fascist torchlight parades that went through Odessa and went through Kiev and went through many other cities. It's down to the fact that the people in the Donbass that I met, they don't feel they left Ukraine. They feel Ukraine left them. They had a democratically elected government. They had a government which seemed to be in perfect balance with both Russia and the West. It didn't want to side totally with Russia, and it didn't want to rush in to the EU and further kind of closeness with NATO. So after the coup, the people in the Donbass would claim that they were actually occupied by their own government. They sent in tanks, they sent in planes. I stood in Lugansk near the civic building where they'd fired a rocket down at a council meeting, and many people were killed in the public square in front of it, and now there's a memorial to the people. I think it was 9 people who died on that particular day. And I think one of the pivotal turning points for a lot of people there was actually Odessa. It was the burning down of the people in the trade union building. So you had this pro-Maidan, anti-Maidan group of people, some who wanted to join Europe.
It was a civil war, essentially, yeah?
Yes, which goes back to the whole... I mean, there's East and West, literally, in Ukraine, where the West is like Catholic and it's more European looking and it's closer to Poland in its ethnicity and its political orientation. And in the East, you have Orthodox Catholics, you have Russian-speaking ethnic people who see an affinity and a fraternity with Russia. So there's always been that kind of, you know, bubbling underneath the surface. There's always been a form of almost sectarianism, I suppose, is the way to look at it. But with the fascists in Kiev taking over the government, with the president having to flee, and he had to be airlifted out by the Russians. They had to come in, find him in a field somewhere. I was speaking to people who said he had a torch, and they were like signalling up into the sky for the Russians to come and bring him back to Moscow. So the people in Donbass will say that they have suffered 8 years of the fascist coup. So it's an unelected coup. They didn't vote for that. They didn't agree with that. They wanted autonomy, which is what you explained about in the Minsk agreements. They didn't want to leave or break up Ukraine. They didn't necessarily want to join the Russian Federation. They wanted a federal state, an autonomous state that would still be Ukrainian in outlook, but have its own civil administration specifically to take care of the needs of the people in that area. So they'll say the coup, Kiev, the fascists, the attack for 8 years, the 14,000 people murdered, the gathering of hundreds of thousands of Azov battalion, right-wing fascists and the right sector and others as part of the Ukrainian military who were building up for an invasion or reinvasion or reoccupation of the Donbass. That's, to my mind, and a lot of people would agree, that's when Russia went in, because there's only 2 ways to look at this. It was either going to be a massacre once those men with that armaments crossed over that border into eastern Ukraine, or they baited the Russians to come in by building up this whole force. But the level of rockets...
And this was, of course, the justification given by NATO for intervening in the Libyan civil conflict. It was the justification given by NATO for the intervention in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, in Serbia. We'll come back, I've no doubt, to these matters. Galina Yemelianova is from the School of Oriental and African Studies, Center of Contemporary Central Asia and the Caucasus, and she's a research associate. Incidentally, the author of a very good book, Russia and Islam, a historical survey, which I have read, and I'm very glad to see you again, Galina. Were you surprised? I confess I was, by the German and French statements that the Minsk II agreements, on which so many of us had hung so many hopes, had never actually been intended to be implemented. Were you surprised?
To be honest, no, I wasn't. First, I want to say you made a very great summary of the facts, and Fra provided such a wonderful insight, deep insight, so which I completely kind of agree with. But regarding the admission by Merkel and Hollande and Poroshenko, I'm not surprised because this agreement was just, it's true, to save the time from the very beginning, because conflict in Ukraine has many layers, and what happened is just reflected one of the layers, which is Ukrainian nation building and state building through demonization of Russia. And the groundwork for this bigger picture is asymmetrical end of the Cold War, when the Eastern institution of Cold War were dismantled, was opaqued, and the Western institution of the Cold War were expanded. So which created security dilemma for Russia, and which created risks for security for the whole Europe. So that's kind of a bigger picture what it is. So in 2014, both sides couldn't, I think, to progress, because Russia wasn't strong enough yet to kind of act to protect its security and safeguard its security interest. On the other hand, 60% of Ukrainian hardware was destroyed, so they couldn't. They need to rebuild. So to some extent, that's what it is. It was kind of compromise on both sides. Yeah, buying time, yes.
Let's hear from Los Angeles, from Igor Lopatonok, who is a Ukrainian-American and a very celebrated film director, best known for his film Ukraine on Fire, which he made with the legendary Oliver Stone, which was released in 2016. Igor, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Very appreciate it.
Igor, why do people in the West think this conflict began in February 2022, when in fact it started 8 years earlier than that, in 2014?
Yes, that's a big misrepresentation here, because everybody thinking that was all started on February 2022, but it's not, because everything was lead to the war in Donbas was originated from the coup d'etat in Kiev in February 2014. And in April of 2014, when interim President Alexander Turchinov make an order to start so-called anti-terror operation in Donbas, what was practically mean a war, and using the military and paramilitary voluntary battalions against the civil population of Donbas, what the population was rebelling and disobeying to Kiev government. And they start using the heavy artillery, tanks, and more and more and more. And this is how that war was started. As we know, and everybody confirmed it, and Angela Merkel confirmed it, and Hollande. So Minsk agreement was just a smoke and mirror to buy time to rearm Ukraine, to build Ukrainian military forces. And this is how we now understand the Ukrainian offense in Donbass was scheduled for March 8, 2024. And of course, they failed.
Who were the major players in the Donbass, in the conflict starting in 2014?
No, first of all, the major players was Ukrainian government. I could call it not a government, but a regime or junta, because they come to power in a completely unconstitutional way. They violently overthrow democratically elected president Yanukovych. He told us that story himself in 2014 when Oliver Stone interviewed him for our film Ukraine on Fire. And they want to kill him as well. This is why he fled Ukraine. And what's happened next? The two rebellious regions, Lugansk and Donetsk, was holding the referendum to separate from Ukraine in 2014. That was first time when they hold a referendum. And they organized the resistance. They organized self-organizing resistance. And it was a chain of assassination in the Donbas. They killed the first leader of Donetsk Republic, Zakharchenko. They blow him there with device. That's what Ukrainian did. That's how badly. But on another side, Ukraine don't want to reassimilate Donbas. And the political reason was because Donbas was all the time very much against that ideology of Bandera, ideology of ultra-radical nationalists. So if the Donbas will re-emerge into electoral field of Ukraine, that will be dramatically change the balance of power in Ukrainian parliament and Ukrainian government. And Ukrainians who sit in that parliament, they don't want it. That political forces, they want to keep this balance as it is, giving them ability, because with that 4 million people living in Donbas, practically, mostly, like a 90% pro-Russian way, and thinking in a Russian way, believing in Russia, and of course they will choose a different political representatives to that parliament. So that's what Ukrainians want to avoid at all costs.
Well, Western media very scantily covered the conflict in eastern Ukraine in 2014 onwards, but the United Nations was strangely quiet also. Why?
You know what's interesting? The entire United Nations position and the Organization of Security in Europe was very biased because they mostly look on the violation what rebellion forces did. They do not look so closely on Ukrainian violations. I want to point this fact, this very interesting fact, when we analyze in the last 2 weeks of report, because you know the common narrative in the West now it was unprovoked invasion of Russia, unprovoked. Provoking was so big. So let me give you the numbers. For example, on a January 3, 2022, that was around 50, 60 ceasefire violation a day. And during the latest day before Russians started that operation, that was more than 2,000 ceasefire violation, and 1,000 of them was an explosive blow or any kind of mines or shells or big explosive. So this is how bad it was. The last 2 weeks, Ukraine start warming up the troops, and even the Russians has an evidence. They seize the classified order from Ukrainian military, for National Guard of Ukraine, for preparing special combat battalions and warming them up to organize that offense on Donbass. And they also want to, in a parallel way, to start offense on Crimea. So of course, that cannot make Russian wait any longer.
Which side of the conflict, in your opinion, is the more responsible for the failure to implement the agreement called Minsk II?
Well, let's say that Russians take it very seriously because they was thinking that they on a way to peace, on a way to resolve that conflict. On another side, Ukraine, of course, Ukraine is a complete failure on the implementing of Minsk agreement, because Minsk agreement saying that supposed to be election, but after the Ukraine will grant the security and autonomy to Donbas region. They never implement it. They never go through parliament, and president never signed this law. So it was outlined in the Minsk agreement, and they never proceed to this.
Much more after the break. Stay tuned. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al Mayadeen Television, coming to you from London, discussing the roots, the origins of the current war in Ukraine. Robert Inlakesh is a journalist, writer, and investigative documentary maker. We heard from an even more eminent filmmaker than you just before the break. When you are working with Oliver Stone, I'll take that back. Wasn't he really saying that age-old story that the blood of some people is more valuable than the blood of others? We know that Palestinian blood is of very little consequence, Syrian blood and so on. Ditto the Russian people in the east of Ukraine, no?
Exactly, and that is the way it is being presented to a Western audience. And for instance, we talk about the reporting about what was happening in the Donbass. There was no reporting, essentially, or little to any reporting about what was actually going on. We are provided absolutely no context whatsoever for what happened preceding the invasion itself. So if we're given no context, if as well RT is blocked on all social media platforms so you cannot see it, which by the way, RT you can access from Ukraine. If you go and put a VPN on your phone right now, if you're in Europe and watching this, and then you attempt to open RT, you will be able to go and find RT. But when you erase the entire history and context, then it's very difficult for anybody to know what's going on. A very similar thing has been done with the war in Yemen. Because the war in Yemen, there's no relevance specifically to the people in the West. They just pretend like it wasn't happening for years and years, since 2015. There was little to no reports on it whatsoever, other than in the Trump administration when they could attempt to blame the war on Trump for political goals. That's in the American media, MSNBC, CNN were doing as such. But when you have such reporting, one-sided reporting at that, for instance, you just mentioned the plight of the Palestinians. When Palestinians throw Molotov cocktails or they throw stones at Israeli military vehicles, they're not presented as heroes. They're presented as terrorists and shot dead in the street because of it. This is something I've witnessed myself. So when you're talking about now, they're presenting Ukrainians as heroes for doing as such, and even giving them guides, as they did from day dot, to attack Russians. And as well, this blatant Russophobia that we see, where everything Russian needs to be banned, everything Russian is bad. It's very similar to the way the reporting was towards the Muslim and Arab world for a very long time, when they wanted to try and justify going and invading Iraq, for instance, and all of their foreign policy catastrophes in the region, being the United States and the Western world, which followed it. So when you're looking at this, they need to build a narrative of hate surrounding a people, and they need to rob you of all the context. And that is what they consistently do. And that is why over here, if you try and have a civil and normal discussion about this topic, which is not just black and white, you're going to get shouted down or, in some cases, put on kill lists.
And the very least that can happen is you'll be taken off platforms or falsely labelled on platforms as a kind of health warning to people not to believe the truths that you are talking. Galina, the more we heard from both Igor and Fra, the more I wondered why Western Ukraine would want to continue to coexist with overwhelmingly Russian-oriented people in the east of their country. If ever a country was crying out for a partition, it was that one. Now it's being partitioned by force. Why did they want to hang on to it? Was it to do with the immense riches in the Donbass, mineral riches, coal and industrial development and so on? What was the reason?
Yes, I suppose it's one of the reasons. But with Ukraine, Ukraine is just very complex ethnically, and ideologically and culturally entity. And from 20th century, there were two projects. One was kind of Monist project, one to make autochthonous, culturally Ukrainian, nationalistically Ukrainian entity as a state. And the other one pluralistic as Ukraine, because it's so multi-ethnic. It's not just ethnic ethnic Russians or Russian speakers. There are other people. There are Hungarians, Hungarian. That's right. There are
Poles,
Jews.
of course.
Yes, it's very multi. Especially look at Odessa. It's such a multi-ethnic place. So these two projects always competed, and I suppose until 2014 there was a balance between these two projects. That's why Ukraine within these borders kind of existed, although there were permanent kind of political disturbances and change of regime, numerous kind of regrouping of political elites. But nevertheless, till 2014, there was a kind of party of regions, which is with Yanukovych and the rest, which balanced all of this. What happened in 2014, that the party, which was a Manist party, which go for Ukraine, nationalistic Ukraine, represented by the West, took over. And they start imposing their view of Ukraine on the whole territory. So they want to Ukrainize the whole territory, which they inherited from the Soviet period, because Lenin added quite a lot, Stalin added even more to this territory, and then it's much bigger territory than originally. If we look historically, what was Ukraine, it's Galicia. If we look, it's very, very small bit.
Now, Donald Kortar is an unusual fellow. He's an American journalist working out of Moscow. Let's get that almost unique perspective. Donald, welcome to the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.
Donald, you've made a film about this. Oddly, a very large number of people think the war began in February of last year. But you know it started 8 years before.
I mean, it's definitely safe to say that it started back in 2014 after the Euromaidan coup d'etat in Ukraine, because this basically was the overthrow of a democratically elected government. Whatever you want to say about the government that was there before, they had democratic elections, and the Euromaidan coup d'etat that actually was taken over by neo-Nazis, actual neo-Nazis in Ukraine, they hijacked this protest movement to install the government we know in Kiev today. And basically, the people of Lugansk and Donetsk, the former regions of Ukraine, they didn't want to live under this fascist-backed neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalist regime. So they declared that they were going to secede from Ukraine, which they said they had a constitutional right to do according to the Ukrainian constitution, because the borders of Ukraine, according to the constitution, are allowed to be changed, obviously, but according to the constitution, it needs to be according to an all-Ukrainian national referendum, but they didn't recognize the federal government there. So they appealed to international law, which gives people in this situation the right to self-determination. So they held referendums to declare the independent people's republics of Donetsk and Lugansk. Kiev did not respect these referendums. They launched what they call to be an anti-terrorist operation. In 2015, they attacked the people's republics and tried to take them back by force, even though the people there of over 3 million did not want to be that way. They did not want to live under this fascist government, which they showed through the referendums, just like in Crimea at the time, but obviously they joined the Russian Federation. They voted for that in their referendum. So from that time, from the launch of the so-called anti-terrorist operation in Ukraine, the people of Donbass had been suffering under Ukrainian war crimes that are even documented by the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Amnesty International has documented them as well. And this has been going on for basically 8 years before the actual special military operation began. And that's actually the name of a documentary I did 8 years before, documenting how the people of Donbass suffered.
The film you made about all of these matters is, of course, a work of great art and should be seen by everyone. But why were you the only one to make it? This was ethnic cleansing on a very grand scale. It was happening in Europe to Europeans. Why did people ignore it so comprehensively?
Well, first of all, the reason for that is because the Western media had its own political agenda. Because actually, throughout these 8 years in Russian media, this conflict was once in a while still reported on. People knew about it, which is why in Russia itself, there's a lot of support for the military operation. I mean, statistics say that the majority of the population supports it. They support Putin's administration in launching it because they understand what was going on there. In terms of the Western media's attention to this, the reason there was such a lack of it, I think, was because if they gave the people of the West information about what was going on there, a lot of people would have come to the same conclusions that the Russian people came to, that Kiev is abusing these people. And there was definitely also an information blockade throughout those 8 years on information in English coming out of Donetsk and Lugansk as well. I'm well acquainted with the media outlets that existed there, the journalists there that did all they could to show the reality of what was going on there. And the Ukrainian government and the Western governments were trying everything they could to make sure information didn't come out of there. And I think they did a good job, unfortunately. So,
I mean, much of what you've described constitute war crimes, crimes against humanity. Tell us some of the things that you witnessed and collected the observations for the film.
Personally, what I saw when I was there, and to give you an idea, I spent most of my time on the border within the Lugansk People's Republic before Russia recognized them as independent. I spent most of my time on the Lugansk People's Republic side near the front line. What I saw personally, first of all, there were constantly artillery bombardments every day. And a mortar shell had fallen where I ended up wanting to do this interview with the residents of this community just about an hour before we got there. It was an hour earlier we could have been hit by that mortar shell. And this is a place where there are no military installations around. Another place that I went to was a border town or like a border residential area near what they used to call the confrontation line between the Donetsk People's Republic and the Ukrainian line. They were constantly shelling around places where people just lived, where there were no military in sight. There were no restrictions of where you could go because there was a military installation or anything. There was nothing like that. But I also heard, from people living in these border villages where I didn't see it with my own eyes, but I heard these stories that Ukrainian tanks would roll up to the line of confrontation and deliberately shoot at villages where there were no military present. The snipers, I heard that snipers on the Ukrainian side used to take pot shots at civilians because, they weren't civilians to the Ukrainian military at that time. They were considered separatists or Russian occupiers, even though the people who lived there had lived there their entire lives.
Fra, lately President Putin has been, if you like, locating all of this in a civilizational context. And more recently, he said that this was part of an uprising in the world against hegemony, against the domination of what we might call the Anglo-Saxon bubble that has ruled the world more or less for several centuries. I realize that's a long way from the grim streets of the Donbass that you witnessed and that Donald Courter was talking about there. But do you think it deserves that, as it were, more profound explanation?
Absolutely, and I think you could look at it in two parts or two aspects. One would go back to the Second World War, 1950s, and the CIA using Bandera and people to continue the Cold War as such in Ukraine against the Russians and building up that nationalism, and the fact that there were fascist Ukrainians who joined Waffen-SS. They murdered Jewish people. They murdered Ukrainians by their tens of thousands. So there's a history of animosity between the right-wing elements in Ukraine, which are backed, financed and organised from the West, and with the people of Russia. But I think you're also alluding to a multipolar world that is now coming about. which is absolutely fantastic because the West, the white European Saxon elite, have ruled the world not through cooperation, not even politically, but through violence and the threat of violence. You heard Lavrov speak recently when he was in Africa, that when he spoke to the different foreign leaders of those particular governments, and he asked them, who do you support in the war, or what's your take, or what's your foreign policy going to be? Lots of those foreign ministers told Lavrov that if they didn't side with the Americans would sanction them. The Americans would, potentially form more colour revolutions that we're seeing in other parts of Europe. Destabilise the government, destabilise society, and potentially, I know we're talking about American hegemony, but if you look at the French, as we're talking about Africa, they're getting kicked out of Mali, they're getting kicked out of Burkina Faso. They have actually been accused of fomenting and encouraging ISIS and encouraging terrorism within those countries as a way of keeping the country divided so that their Western elite corporations can go in and resource theft in those regions. So with Iran, and with Russia, and with China, and now India, and they're talking about Venezuela, and you may be talking about Nicaragua, and many other of the Latin American, Caribbean countries. They're all starting to take a step back and say, perhaps we can stand up to the West, perhaps we can stand up to this so-called unipolar world order run by America, financed by America, and the benefits of American corporations. So,
Galina, it is true, isn't it, that virtually all of Africa, actually all of Latin America, the great majority in Asia, have rejected the demands of the empire to demonize Russia, to stop trading with it, stop buying its oil and gas, and so on. And so is Putin right that this has triggered a shift in the tectonic plates in the world, and that something more profound than just a civil war, albeit a terrible one, in just a single Eastern European country?
Yes, I think, yes, that's what we're witnessing now, because Russia doesn't have a colonial past like Britain or France. Okay, we could say Central Asia, but I think Central Asia, it's quite difficult. I wrote about it. It's a bit different relations because it was continental, and Central Asians were involved in policy making, like Caucasians. It's not exactly what British or French or Belgian empires were. So in this sense, and during Soviet period, when Russians support national liberation movements in Africa and the Middle East, there is still very warm feeling and feelings of gratitude to Russia as a kind of supporters against imperialism. So Russia has despite of absence for 20 years during Perestroika and Yeltsin period, it's the memory is still there. There are people speaking Russian, so and people welcome Russia because they could now kind of speak more freely, because before they just couldn't. Under globalization, which equal Americanization, people just were pushed into economic, political submission and have to play the liberal rules, the capitalist rules. And now there is another alternative. It's not communist alternative, but at least it is alternative to American way of life.
Putin is carefully highlighting the extent to which certain cultural norms and practices that are now hegemonic in the West are not actually shared by people in the global South. They're not shared by the majority of Russian people. He highlights issues of transgenderism and so on. So he's pushing buttons which receive a response in much of the world. The West is, after all, precisely 13% of the population of the world.
Yes, it's very important in Russia because Putin and positioned Russia as a civilization, as an Orthodox civilization, which historically was in opposition to Latin civilization, which he embodied first in Europe, now in America. But what he is saying that now the West losing its kind of religious element of its civilization and filling it with its own notion what's right. So everybody has, and they kind of establishing new rules for the world, but not based on some divine kind of truths like religion, Abrahamic religion, but just rules which they create, which makes world safer for America, for American capitalism, and
Well, yeah. At least the bombs are painted in rainbow colours. Robert, the Middle East, your area of specialism, is itself undergoing a tremendous shift in this regard. The Saudi Arabian foreign minister was in Moscow in the middle of a war, proposing the deepening of ties between Saudi Arabia and Moscow. Saudi Arabia is now trading with China in Chinese currency in terms of the sale of oil, breaking the dollar dictatorship that has existed since Bretton Woods. Do you see this as having significance right across the Arab Middle East?
I believe it does have a certain significance in that you see with Saudi Arabia being one example of many examples of Middle Eastern and Northern African countries not listening in the same way they once would. It's not to say that the United States does not have a role in the Middle East, but I would argue that their role is fading. The catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan signaled a strong message to the region, in addition to the fact as well that the United States encouraged the war in Yemen to start and to continue, and has failed to provide a solution, and basically provides military hardware and backing to countries under the guise of security, and attempts them to get them on board with an anti-Iranian policy to fight certain other actors in the region to allegedly keep them safe. And I think we're at a point now where Middle Eastern nations are not looking towards going into all of the wars and conflicts of the United States just for the sake of it and for security. And they understand that there are different dynamics inside the Middle East, including the development of Iran itself, where just the United States will not provide you security, and just looking in one direction now and thinking of this as a unipolar world is counterproductive.
Last word to you, Fra. That leaves us the last man standing, doesn't it? All of Europe has been reduced to vassalage towards the United States, even when it is manifestly against their own interests. But Britain is very definitely, organically attached, if not at the hip, then as the tail of the American dog. Can we expect any change in that, or will we go down with the US empire?
I think Britain will go down with the US empire. I think when we look at the history of the British government, the history of British imperialism, the history of British colonial occupation all over the world, and even up more recently to the Iraq War, where you and 2 million people stood outside the Houses of Parliament calling for no war on Iraq. You weren't listened to. 2 million people were defied by a government of 635 people, or whatever the number happens to be. They decide to go to war. So the government won't listen to the people. They won't listen to the anti-war movement and the anti-war sentiment of the population. But I think that Britain will continue to follow the American lead. Wherever they go, Britain will follow. And as you say, less than 13% of the world's population, with probably 80% of the world's finance and maybe 60% of the world's military power at the moment. That'll all fade, and they'll just be the forgotten men of the 21st century, hopefully.
Bing Crosby and Bob Hope sang a song in a very famous film that most of you are far too young to have ever seen. And the refrain was, "We'll follow the old man wherever he wants to go." And it appears we'll follow the oldest of old men, Joe Biden, right over the cliff. We hope that this has provided some kind of historical, political, strategic background to the conflict in Ukraine, and that you have found it valuable. I've been George Galloway. You have been a marvellous audience. Thanks for watching.